His method is actually very similar to what we were using in the 60s called the audiolingual method, a lot of repetition, memorization, repetition. What Roscius did was he speeded it up so that it goes about 3 times as fast as a normal class does. And you were talking before about wanting to be put under pressure. The students in Roscius classes are under pressure. The teachers are taught how to basically give them drills, and they will walk around the room snapping their fingers and pointing at people like that. And if you don't respond within about 1 second, you get marked down.
Oh my God. I went to my Chinese one
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Well, that's the Roscius method is used.
I like it now.
The Roscius method is used other places. If you look at what language learning research says, we do have a pretty good body of research now. Some of what I'll be telling you today is oversimplifications, overgeneralizations, but still useful ones, I think, of what we've learned from the research. We don't know how to teach languages the way we know how to, deal with athletic injuries or things like that, because we haven't put millions and millions of dollars into the research. But it's no longer just an art. It's not just if you're a good teacher and you know a language, you can be a good language teacher. Maybe you can be, but if you don't know why you're doing things, you're going to start making mistakes. And what we have now is some information about what works better and what works better at different levels with different kinds of students. That it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that's the problem with almost every method, is it sets up a series of statements about these things must be done, and they work with some students and not with others, or work with some levels and not with others. Interestingly, beginning language can be taught in a huge variety of ways successfully. So one method from the late 1960s actually was the one I demonstrated when I came in, total physical response. It was developed at San Jose State, of all places, and by a guy named Asher. And in that one, the teacher does all the talking and the students just do things. At the same time, there was a method developed called the silent way, where the teacher does almost no talking and the students do all the talking. The teacher basically is a mime, and the students learn from each other. So the teacher will maybe say something once and try to get another student to say it well, and once a student has a pretty good model, the students model on each other. It sounds bizarre, but it works because it focuses everybody's attention. Other methods, there was one called Suggestopedia, developed by a Bulgarian psychologist, where you began your language class sitting in an easy chair with your eyes closed, listening to classical music, so that your brain became relaxed and ready to absorb new language information. That was a real popular one. and many, many others. What we discovered, by going through that and by starting to do research, is that there is no one right method. And this was developed as a framework so that you could take total physical response in the silent way and break them down analytically and say, what are they really trying to do? So, as it turns out, this is a very valuable framework for dealing with how to teach a class. Because anytime you teach a class, you do have a method. You may be conscious of it, you may not be so conscious of it, and you may or may not have a theory, maybe you just have ideas about how languages are learned. But all this information, in one form or another, needs to be there, and what you want to do as a teacher is make it, or as a materials developer for that matter, is make it coherent. So let's start with, I just think this is something valuable for you to be aware of, and even potentially to use when you train your teachers. So in place of this method, let's just say a language class. So every language class has an approach. And to simplify things, you can read in a little more detail there, but to simplify things here, the approach says, ideas about what language is. And ideas about language learning. So how languages are learned. So what is it that you're trying to learn, and what's the process for doing it? Or what are the processes? And that part of what I was asking you in your group discussion there is, what were the processes that you noticed? So this is kind of, in the ideal world, this is a theory with research behind it. If you go over to the linguistics department, you will be introduced to a number of theories of language. Some of those theories are very structural, talking about how language is composed of, syntax and morphology and phonology. But if you talk to a sociolinguist, while you get some of that, you also get the idea that language is composed of messages and communication and cultural information. All of that is woven into it as well. And depending on what you think it is that you're teaching, whether it's just sort of language, for example, in isolation from culture, or primarily culture with language as the vehicle through which culture comes in, that changes what you do. The ideas about language learning are even more diverse. So do you learn language by studying it, the same way you study chemistry or study math? Do you learn language just by using it? Do you learn language primarily by listening? That was what I was demonstrating at the beginning of this with the total physical response. Or do you learn language primarily by speaking? What's the relationship of listening and speaking? What's the relationship of literacy to the spoken language? Some methods say you always build literacy on top of the spoken language. Other methods try to teach all four skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, simultaneously. In fact, that's typically the way it's done here. So these are all important things to have thought about. And teachers often, if they haven't had the training for it, don't think about it. They have these assumptions, these ideas, but they haven't necessarily reflected on them or challenged them. They're based on the way they were taught. What they liked, what they didn't like, what some particularly influential teacher did, or maybe what some book tells them to do. And language is so lot more complex than that.